here we are. Welcome to the world. We're going to enter 3 classes on Julius Caesar this week. We're going to talk obviously about production history and cultural context. Then next week we're going to go through our little descriptive thing, probably, pieces of the play, parts of the drama thing. And then my favorite, third, we'll do the charting. We'll have a different chart just for fun, just because I don't want you all to get bored with the same old one. So, here's lesson number 1 for the day, and that is that you usually don't have to go very far to find answers to things. And I just looked at Maylee's book, and I was like, why didn't I read the introduction to that? Because that would have really solved all of my problems for today. The amount of books that I pulled off my shelf yesterday and this morning was about 22 to try to find all the information that's in that essay in the Pelican. So don't think that you don't have access to this information very readily, because you do. So we'll see what we come up with. I don't know. Am I hitting that or are you hitting that? Right. Okay. So you guys may remember my I can't really walk around, can I? My love of Mr. Aristotle, and this seemed to be a salient quote that seemed to go with this play. By way of introduction for this particular play, however, I'd like to set up a couple of different things. Yesterday we were in a meeting talking about Merchant of Venice and what to do contextually in terms of helping community and audiences post-Merchant talk about the issues that may come up for people as they see this very problematic play. And one of the things that came up was that 10 years ago, 10 years ago, we had done a similar kind of thing when we had done Merchant of Venice, when we had this big newsprint thing. Does anybody remember, those of you who are this big newsprint thing that had a bunch of quotes on it? And it wasn't making a stance one way, it was just like a bunch of quotes, just sort of giving a little history of sort of Shylock, blah, 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 blah. And we said, well, why don't we just reprint that thing? We've got it, we've done it, and the point fact is when we looked at it, it actually is not addressing the same things that we're addressing this year, 10 years later, right? So I guess the point of all of this investigation for me, a constant reminder that these are new plays, and they must be entered even for those of us who have done them 12 times as if they were new plays. And that my theory is that what you remember about the play is what you saw the last, is what you kind of stuck in the last time you saw it, and that interpretation is the one that sticks with you, and that is the definition of traditional, the last time you saw it. So how do we go back in there and kind of enter again and sort of look at these plays over and over and over again? I think, not last time, or not one of the times during Measure, Jerry had brought this up too, that we were talking about sort of the kinds of time that are in every play, when the play is written, when the play is set, when the play is produced, and then our extra category of Shakespeare is like director's choice, like where they want to set it, which can be a different time from those 3 times, and that's always true of all of these. But the extra thing I wanted to talk about today in terms of Julius Caesar, because we're about to enter a different kind of material in a way, is this kind of notion of comparative time, which has to do with what somebody knew at the time that they write it. It's a frightening concept to think that most people know of Julius Caesar from this play, not from the A&E biography. Do you know what I mean? Like we does. And yes, this is the scary piece about our job, isn't it? Because while it is ultimately a fiction, it is fictional, what we're doing. Point in fact is because we're actually doing it, it is a fact. Somebody has witnessed you doing that thing on stage, so that fiction becomes a kind of fact. And it's a scary blurring for some people, right? There's a certain power in the persuasion of theater in that political kind of way, because it was a fact and 600 people agreed that they saw this fact, even though it's a fiction, right? So the fact of the matter is that because this is a fictional account of a historical event, that in some ways the blurring of this, I think, is just sort of interesting to kind of always remember, kind of unpack. The fact of the matter is that a lot of people, just like a lot of people get their news from Comedy Central and Jon Stewart, which I don't think I object to necessarily. You just have to be sort of skeptical and sort of very clear about what your source is, and not one source cannot be all and all. That sort of thing. And so for me, what was very interesting to think about this particular play is what did Shakespeare know about Julius Caesar? And I think I've said this to you before, so I'm sorry that I'm going to repeat myself for the next year about the same three things I know. But that is that it has been said that in the daily New York Times, you know more about the world than an Elizabethan would have known in his entire lifetime. Not the Sunday New York Times even. The daily New York Times, right? And so when we're going 400 years ahead of, you can't sort of say, let's erase the Holocaust, for instance, or let's erase World War I, or whatever it is, the Civil War, or whatever it is that we can grab onto. So you can see how people, sometimes directors, want to use some of these other historical markers as a way for us to enter, because some of us will hold on to that to a certain degree and bring that to the production as well, and that will have value. Sometimes, however, that value will be more of a filter, and you just kind of don't know till you line something up. This is the scary part for us in the theater, right? Until you line everything all up, all the king's horses and all the king's men, blah, 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 blah. Sometimes, you know, Humpty doesn't get put back together, but that's sort of the project. But what to me was always interesting to me to figure out where a writer, where the information is that a writer. And so a lot of people talk about, you know, what was in Shakespeare's library. There's several very famous essays about what he might have read, and of course this has led to a very interesting speculation of how he couldn't be who he was because he wouldn't have had access to a library, because if you were just a gentleman from Stratford, how could he have read the blah, 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 blah. I have a friend who is the current Lord Burleigh, and he lives here in Ashland, as a matter of fact, and he is an Oxfordian for the sheer fact that he knows that the Earl of Oxford was in his family's library, whatever date that was, and visited all. You know, it's so interesting, right? It's like, where does he have access to these kinds of things? So it's always something I like to kind of try and figure out slightly. Now, of course, you have to be kind of careful about this anyway. Just because something's on the page, does that mean the playwright actually believes that thing or not, right? And we have this whole thing about Shakespeare and sort of the genius category, things like he was all things to all people, all times, and this was a romantic notion from the early 19th century, of course. And Harold Bloom has helped it a lot by saying that Shakespeare invented the human. So, and in this particular play, which has got a very interesting balance to it, does it? Pro-Republican and not really. I mean, is he justifying regicide to a certain degree? I mean, what are the consequences? He's kind of sets it up to a certain degree, but then he takes it down as well. And it's an interesting sort of balancing act that's going on in this particular play. So how does he really feel about it? Who really knows? But what we're going to talk about today is kind of what the times were like and the fine line he might have been walking. You always have to kind of put it in these sort of things. It might have been walking, all these speculative things. There's so many things we don't really know about Shakespeare, but actually there's a lot of things that we do know. And we actually know more about him as the man and the writer than we know about, I think, any other Elizabethan writer. So it's always interesting to think this through. So this notion of what's known about the world at the time of the writing, what were his sources and what was the world that he was involved in and trying to respond to, which is what we talked a lot about Measure, well, Merchant too, but Measure last time. What is he responding to? What are those kinds of things that he's borrowing from? I do not think genius exists in a vacuum. So it may just be, as James Shapiro says in his book, 1599, the year of Shakespeare, or the year of Shakespeare, 1599, whatever the title of that thing is, that genius knows how far to go before getting into too much trouble. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Okay?